perceive, that increased liquidity, being as it's a finite system, can only come at the compromisation of others' liquidity, generally whose? Ours. So whoever is not an investment bank. So this isn't to our advantage either. But when you claim that regulators are very vigilant because as these things precipitate upon us, they may perceive them and work against them to preserve the very things such as investment banks and banking itself, which is the cause of our destruction. It's not even remotely to our favor. All it means is that they're perpetuating the lie of economy for their own benefit. So, and this is only to loot every republic of the world in the last days of that republic, after 100 years here in the United States of under an unassented central bank, which even President Wilson, he apologized profusely for presiding over this creation of this central bank. So, there isn't a single principle that it could possibly service. It only acts to our destruction. When you're talking about regulation, preserving the very entities which deprive us of the of just reward for our production, you're really not even you're pretending that this is a testament of our benefit. But the reason that no qualification of that assertion it can ever exist is because, on the contrary, it is not to our benefit at all. All this is only to our further cost.
On September 7, 2008, Henry Paulson announced the federal takeover of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two giant mortgage lenders on the brink of collapse.
Let's not make Hayek's mistake here. When we talk about federal takeovers through a purportedly Federal Reserve System, you're really talking about a private takeover. The Federal Reserve is called the Federal Reserve to deceive the American public that it was part of government, which they have a say in. In fact, it is 12 private corporations which act independently of government. Any purported regulation is impertinent, as we've explained, because its general role is to obfuscate our promissory obligations, to pretend to be creditor for merely publishing evidence of our promissory obligations to each other, therefore being an unassented publisher which merely intervenes upon our commerce, to merely publish evidence of our promissory obligations to each other and multiply this into dispossession of all our production by this obfuscation. So when we talk about a federal takeover, even if the brains of these two other lending agencies, which are in effect peripheral banks to the central bank, and what I mean by peripheral banks is you have the central bank is the publisher of the evidence of our promissory obligations to each other. The central bank, in effect, cannot fail. I mean, if anything is left standing in the end of the terminal life cycle that this monstrosity imposes upon us, if anything is left, it's the central bank. The peripheral banks, this arrangement of peripheral banks allows them to participate in the graft, but they can only succeed in doing so long as we, the ultimate subjects of the system, can succeed in maintaining a vital circulation by this perpetual escalation of borrowing, which is necessary merely to reflate the circulation. When the days of terminal failure are upon us, that is when the sum of artificial indebtedness so exceeds us that it so compromises industry that our survival is marginal, even at the lowest rates of interest, which are conceivable to a purported banking system. When all this happens upon us, we have in this situation of terminal failure, which is so important for us to understand is inevitable and terminal. That is, there is no process of reducing debt by earning our way out of this terminal situation, which has already exceeded us and which we're sustained within only by the purported Federal Reserve System, the central bank, the publisher of our promissory obligations, merely pouring money into circulation so it can circulate right back to them, further increasing their wealth by the means of their unearned wealth at our expense by this fact that the money comes into circulation as a debt to them, an obfuscated debt, a falsified debt, when a promissory obligation in fact is comprised of our obligations to each other, which the bank is not even concerned in. It gives up nothing of earned, produced wealth to comprise this debt. So when this process of reflation multiplies the sum of artificial indebtedness into terminal indebtedness, we have a situation when we, the unwitting subjects of this ancient ruse, can no longer afford to service our debts as prices are escalated further, etc., etc., etc. And so what happens is these peripheral banks then are compromised. They have, quote, borrowed the money from the central bank in order to lend it to us at further margin, or its margin of profitability. When we can no longer continue to service some of these debts, the peripheral banks are compromised because nonetheless they're liable to repay the purportedly borrowed money, which is merely published into existence. Nonetheless, they can no longer afford to service their purported borrowings to the central bank, so they begin to fail. So when we increase their liquidity or sustain their liquidity or restore some of their liquidity, which is destroyed by this obfuscation of the currency, all we're talking about is a death struggle here, which preserves these unnecessary entities, banks and peripheral banks and in purported investment banks. All we're doing is talking about preserving these things, which are only dispensable parts of a system. In fact, they're parts which we're actually obligated to eradicate if we resolve these issues. So it's a huge mistake for us to think that by somehow preserving these peripheral banks or preventing them from doing, quote, bad things, unquote, with our money, which is really not our money because we've given up, we've wrongly condescended to this idea that we can only get our own promissory obligations by borrowing them, of all things, from a mere publisher of evidence of our promissory obligations. So when we talk about a purported federal takeover here, what is this associated with? Even if the real federal government, as opposed to the Federal Reserve banks, which are 12 private corporations, even if the real federal government was the actual taker of these, had taken the reins of these, failing, loaning institutions, which are peripheral banks to this central banking system which has been imposed upon us. Even if the federal government took the reins, the real takeover is by the central bank, because after all, the central bank is sustaining the federal government by publishing more evidence of our promissory obligations to which are no longer to each other, that are to the central bank. By this obfuscation of the currency, how does it sustain this system against failure? It pours money into it by accumulating further debt, which isn't even to be serviced. And of course, if it did this to the private sector, we'd start thinking a little harder, and we'd go, well, they're giving away money. Why did they loan us money before? They can't violate the principles so blatantly. So they, through their usurpations of representation, readily persist in this further artificial situation, which is part of the necessary deception in the time of the end, in the end of this life cycle, in which they pour money into circulation, allowing the quote unquote government to assume further debt which we aren't even servicing. So in truth, it's not hurting us, but on paper we're not feeling the pain of this failure, because if we serviced the further accumulations of debt to the degree that we would find we're already in a far worse situation than what precipitated in the Great Depression. And of course, the magnitude of improprieties or pain that we would suffer under such a failure can only get worse as we allow this further artificial accumulation of further debt beyond our creditworthiness to persist. The only way to solve all these issues is to transform this system into mathematically perfected economy, and in the process of doing so, rectifying as much as is practical all of the consequences, detrimental consequences which have been imposed upon us. And of course, we do this by refinancing all debt under mathematically perfected economy, which means counting all prior payments of interest instead toward principal, which itself resolves practically all of the artificial debt in the world. And then, of course, we pay the remaining principal at the rate of consumption or depreciation of the remaining value of the property, and these two things alone make us